this afternoon, Dr. Sunil Bhar. Now, Sunil is probably no stranger to the ARCVic family. He's been a part of our board. I think he started as a volunteer many years ago on our helpline as well, and has also been very much a part of our OCD and Anxiety Week and Mental Health Care Week when we've run them in the past as well as during the year. Sunil is a clinical psychologist and associate professor of the psychology of Swinburne University, and he's going to be presenting on working through fear and panic, acknowledging that fear and panic can be really debilitating and very disabling for many people and can stop us from doing things that we enjoy in our life. So Sunil will discuss today some everyday activities that we can implement to assist us in these situations. So please welcome Sunil Bhar.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here and to engage you in a discussion, a conversation about anxiety and fear and panic. And we've got about half an hour to do that. Anxiety is a funny word. It gets a lot of bad press, really. Okay. On the one hand, the word anxiety conjures up this impression, doesn't it? Being out of control, going through quite an exaggerated experience of terror. In fact, I was looking it up, and anxiety comes from the Latin word anxietas, if I'm pronouncing it, which means anguish. And I think for a lot of people, the word anxiety does conjure up that impression that it's an unwanted, irritable, distressing emotion. That's characterized by all sorts of things, including the ones that you see on the slide: palpitation, chest pain, sweating, trembling, numbness, tingling sensations, hot and cold chills, shortness of breath, feelings of choking, nausea, and the list goes on. Why on earth would anyone want to experience such experiences? And yet, on the other hand, if you've gone through any psychoeducation courses, or if you've worked with a therapist, or if you've jumped online, we're often told that anxiety is really great. It's useful. There's a purpose for feeling this way. It helps us to run away from danger, or it helps us to fight the enemy, right? And if you think about the sorts of changes that happens to us when we feel anxious, it makes sense in a way. For example, if our heart's beating faster, our blood's being supplied in a quicker rate to many parts of our body, which allows us to run away quicker. If we're breathing in a more rapid way, similarly, we're geared for action. When our muscles tense, well, that helps us to defend against blows by the so-called enemy. When we're anxious, we're on high alert, aren't we? We're looking around, we're scanning, we're on edge. And you can only imagine how helpful that would have been in the days of the dinosaur, right? So there's an evolutionary purpose for anxiety. In fact, someone told me that one reason we get sweaty is that it makes us more slippery. Have you heard that explanation? Sure, there's the more boring one, that it cools us down, but I'm intrigued by this idea that when we become slippy, the clammy hands, the so-called perpetrator will lose their grasp. So, we've got two messages, right? Two messages. On the one hand, anxiety is really disastrous for us because of how it makes us feel. And on the other hand, it helps us to run away or fight back, the so-called flight or fight. Now, how do we put these two ideas together? Well, this is one way. Anxiety is useful up to a point. Now, if we didn't feel slightly on edge, some people would say we don't perform as well. Does that make sense? In fact, we see this in the sporting field, where coaches deliberately try and get the team to feel riled up, to know that this is an important game coming up, so that they will perform at their best. We know that if we feel a bit nervous or anxious about a performance, we'll be focusing on that performance, right? If we have an exam coming up, we might feel motivated to study for the exam. So up to a point, this thing called anxiety is pretty useful because it gets us to perform at our best. However, once anxiety gets to a point where it is felt to be distressing, it becomes less useful. And if you can follow this graph, what this is showing you is that as anxiety, let me try this. Oh, look at that. As anxiety becomes more and more severe, this is on the x-axis, performance and health, some people would argue, becomes better and better up to a certain point. But then as anxiety climbs, health and performance begins to deteriorate. So if you become too anxious, you go blank. And you don't do so well in an exam, for example. If you're living with chronic levels of anxiety and stress, that's going to wear you down over time. So your health begins to suffer at high levels of anxiety. In fact, most people have heard of this word, distress. Am I right? That's a pretty common word. But fewer people have heard of eustress, which is good anxiety. So, when people get to this point here, the distress point, that leaves open the door for this thing called anxiety disorders. So what are anxiety disorders? Well, there are a whole bunch of them, and they keep changing depending on the latest edition of this book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is put out by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is one of the lists that you'll find in that encyclopedia or compendium of anxiety disorders. I'll just explain the different ways in which anxiety can present themselves. One of the most common ways is through this thing called phobias. A phobia is essentially an intense fear of a situation, and there are about 3 zillion phobias. In fact, if you Google phobias, you'll get a very impressive list. There's phobias of closed spaces. Do you know what that one's called? Claustrophobia. Phobias of spiders. Anacrophobia. Phobias of phobias. Right? Phobias of possibly not breathing. Phobias of being next to water. And they're very, very impressive Latin names for all of these. Essentially, anything can be the target of a phobia, which is a fear reaction to a situation. Most of us are terrified of snakes, am I correct about that? Or spiders, would that be right? But most of us don't have a phobia because it doesn't interfere with our lives. It's only at the point that it starts to interfere with one's life that a diagnostician might consider a diagnosis of a phobia. A common phobia, which is the second to last one, is called social phobia or social anxiety. And this is the phobia of being in public and doing what I'm doing right now, speaking publicly. In fact, when surveys have been conducted, people are more afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. So the number 1 fear, public speaking. Number 2 fear, dying. Number 3 fear, going blind. That makes sense. But people are excessively afraid of different situations. And they're afraid for different reasons. Sometimes they're afraid of being harmed physically. Very few people who have social anxiety or social phobia are afraid of being harmed physically. Rather, it's a psychological harm that they perceive will come by publicly speaking or eating in public and so on, and that is humiliation. Another common phobia is agoraphobia or agoraphobia. And sometimes this is translated into a meaning such as a fear of a marketplace, which is incorrect. It's really a fear of being in a situation where help is difficult to obtain or embarrassing to obtain. So you'll often find that people with agoraphobia will be reluctant to leave the home because they see the home as the safe environment and any place outside the home as a very dangerous environment, and so on. And then you have panic disorder. Panic is an interesting phenomenon because people often describe panic as being a sudden rush of fear. In fact, it's like being punched in the chest by an experience of fear. It isn't a gradual build-up. It's almost like someone's come over you and placed fear on you immediately. For those of you who have not experienced panic, and there are about 70% typically of the population who've not experienced a panic attack, one of the ways in which you could explain it to them is like you're being suddenly pushed off a cliff but then held back. It's that sudden startle experience. And people with panic disorder have had recurrent experiences like this, and over time they've begun to wonder maybe they're going crazy or maybe something is terribly wrong with them. Because why else would they get heart palpitations and so on? You might have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a fear reaction to having been in a traumatic situation. We often hear about post-trauma in context of war experiences, but it's not limited to that at all. People talk about traumatic experiences such as the threat of dying. So being a victim of a crime, being the recipient of harm, or in some cases even being a witness to someone else getting harmed. And people often talk about having a whole range of symptoms as a result of having been in that traumatic experience. And then you have generalized anxiety disorder. It was nearly relabeled worry disorder, and I wish it was, because at the heart of generalized anxiety disorder is the phenomenon of worrying. Will I be able to fend for myself? Will I be independent as I grow older? Will my children have a good life? Will my finances hold up? Are people around me safe? Will I be the target of a terrorist attack? You know, prior to 9/11, when we heard that worry, will I be the target of a terrorist attack? Our typical response is, come on. Post 9/11, we thought, oh really? Right? So sometimes the legitimacy of worry changes over time. In fact, when we had the advent of AIDS, people began to worry excessively about catching AIDS. Now the worry has shifted to being the victim of radioactive waves as a result of mobile phones. So worry does change with the ages. Obsessive compulsive disorder is a disorder where someone has very, very unwanted, intrusive thoughts. Often the thoughts come in the form of a doubt. For example, when they leave their homes, the doubt might be, is my home safe? Have I left everything as it should have been? And the person is unable to resolve that doubt, and so they'd often resort to compulsions. And in that example, the compulsions might be checking, where they'd go back and check excessively over time. All of us have some level of OCD, but people with the diagnosis of OCD would say that that's got out of hand. The checking or the washing or the ruminating has become so excessive that it's starting to interfere with their life. So why do we feel anxious? Well, there are several explanations to it. There are biological explanations, there are family explanations, there are genetic explanations. But I'm going to offer you one explanation that is very much within my area of interest, and that is how we think. The biologists would say that the biological reason for us feeling all of these symptoms that we've been talking about, like palpitations and sweating, is because there's an alarm center in our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the area of our brain that releases certain chemicals, such as adrenaline. Have you heard of the concept adrenaline rush? Right. That's the part in our brain that is responsible to say, okay, it's time for adrenaline to be released. Right? That part of the brain is really in charge of the alarm reaction. Right? That we know so well by the name anxiety. Right? In biological terms, the amygdala switches on what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which releases adrenaline, noradrenaline, and so on, gets us riled up. So the question that comes up is, why does this alarm center go off? Well, it could go off because we're in real danger. So you're lying in bed at home and something wakes you up, the smell of smoke. And then you hear screaming. The amygdala says, you're in danger. Get up, do something. And so instead of going back to sleep and continuing with your very nice dream, you're sparked into action. Anxiety keeps you alive, right? It prompts you into action. That's one reason why our alarm system goes off. The other reason why our alarm system goes off is that we perceive ourselves to be in danger. And that's a very, very important distinction. The amygdala cannot tell the difference between real danger and perceived danger. So you're lying in bed at home and you hear a noise downstairs and your thought is, oh my God, there's a burglar. I'm going to die. Right? So the amygdala switches on, you're geared into action. Never mind that the noise was caused by a cat. It's the perception of danger that fires the alarm system. Has anyone of you lived with a faulty alarm at home?
Yeah.
All right, that's the first question. Has anyone been woken up by this faulty alarm continuously at 1 a.m.? All right, there's one person. I've got one more question. Has anyone been woken up while it's freezing cold outside and snowing? Oh my goodness, there's one here. Okay, good. Oh, the two, right. So, the point here is that after a while, you soon learn, hang on, this alarm has gone off for the last 3 weeks. I'm on the 9th floor, freezing cold, it's snowing downstairs. I think the alarm's faulty, and I'm going to go back to sleep. In fact, you've made a decision that this so-called ringing by the alarm outside is simply a perception of danger. It's not real. You could be wrong, but over time, you've come to the understanding that there's something wrong with the alarm. So one reason why we feel anxious might be that we're not in fact in danger, but we perceive ourselves to be in danger. And that's the red bit here. It's the thinking, it's the beliefs. Right? So someone encounters a dog, they believe all dogs are dangerous and they're going to bite me and I will die as a result of rabies, and the reaction is anxiety, running away. Someone else encounters a dog, believes, gee whiz, dogs are special creatures on earth, they're gentle as anything. That's not the reaction. It's a very different reaction. The point being here is that the situation or the activating event is exactly the same, but it's the perception or the beliefs that differ, and that difference explains which consequence you experience, whether it's anxiety or pleasure, for example. Now, in the context of panic, just to bring it to an anxiety disorder, what we think happens is as follows. Someone has an experience where they're doing something that very naturally gives them an experience of arousal. So it's very easy to imagine that when you exercise, very naturally your heart's going to beat faster. For some people, however, the perception is because my heart is beating faster, therefore something terrible is happening, I'm dying. And because they have that appraisal, guess what happens to their heartbeat? Does it go down or does it go up? It goes up, absolutely. And when the arousal goes up, they're now thinking, I was right. I am really dying. And then what happens to the heartbeat? It gets aroused and aroused and aroused. And so what we often find with people who are caught in this loop is that the way they're thinking is maintaining their high arousal. Right? The way they think is maintaining how anxious they feel. So, what do you do about this? Well, there are some less useful ways, and there are some more helpful ways. And you'll notice that slides like this can be oversimplistic, because you might argue that, look, things have their place in moderation. And so to address that complexity, you'll see the word of obsessive all through that thing. Excessive avoidance. Why would avoidance be unhelpful? After all, if you avoid dogs, you don't feel anxious. If you avoid arousal, you don't have panic. So why would avoidance be unhelpful? It's like a pregnant pause. I'm hoping you've got an answer in your heads.
It impinges on function.
It impinges on function. Yeah. Someone who has what I've called agoraphobia, right, who stays at home because they feel very anxious when they leave their home, is an extreme example of that, for example. Someone who plots their pathway so that they never encounter dogs might have to spend a lot of time doing that, right? So people say that excessive avoidance becomes a problem because it impedes performance, functioning, and it lowers quality of life. Excessive use of drugs and alcohol is a problem. Excessive reassurance seeking also is labeled as a less helpful way of feeling less anxious. One of the reasons for that is that each time you ask for reassurance, you feel a little bit better. But then over time, you begin to wonder, did I hear that right? Did my family know what they were talking about? Were they simply trying to make me feel better? So you begin to question the legitimacy of that reassurance. And some people react to anxiety with excessive aggression and anger. It's what we often call blowing off steam. And for people that I work with in my practice, I often say, the reason why you behave in that way is that you've got a lot of adrenaline to burn. And one way you burn it is through aggression. You shout and you pace around, but there are so many other ways of burning it, including exercise. Right? So these are perhaps the less useful ways of coping. More useful ways. And here let's just pause for a minute, because when we move to more useful strategies, we're not talking about eliminating anxiety, because we want some anxiety in our lives. Some anxiety is useful. Rather, these strategies are designed to contain anxiety. They're designed to help regulate how intense anxiety becomes. So, here are the more useful strategies. One is exactly what you're doing right now. Attending seminars like this, attending afternoons, learning about anxiety and how it can present itself. What is anxiety really? Well, it's a bunch of symptoms that we've been left with through an evolution of self-protection. Can anxiety really harm me? Well, yes, if it's chronic, my health will suffer for it, but in the short term, anxiety is simply uncomfortable. It's not dangerous. And sometimes our clients find a lot of comfort through remembering that anxiety is uncomfortable, but not dangerous. A second strategy over time is to cultivate what's called an internal locus of control. We're not very good at doing that in our society, I think. For example, if you ask someone, why did you feel anxious? They often talk about the situation. I felt anxious because I was near a dog. Or I felt anxious because I was near the edge of a cliff. Or I felt anxious because someone was shouting at me. People often talk about feeling a certain way because of something external to them. And in fact, what's really happening in all of those situations is that those individuals are feeling anxious because how they perceive the situation, right? Right? If you think dogs are great, you're not going to feel anxious. So it's not the dog that's making you anxious, it's you that's making yourself anxious. In fact, if anyone here is familiar with the superhero world, Bruce Banner, who some of you would know is the human version of the Incredible Hulk, says to someone, don't make me angry, you won't like me when I'm angry, right? And the psychologists go, well, no one's making Bruce angry, he's making himself angry, right? So we often talk about an external situation as forging or cultivating an emotion in us, when it's really how we're thinking about the situation that might have a lot to do with it. So, I am in charge of how I feel. And then the third point is skill power. Again, we're not very good, I think, in our society about thinking about emotional regulation as a skill. We just might think that we're not very good at controlling our emotions, or someone else is better at it. But we don't often think of emotional regulation, emotional control, as a set of skills. And I would like to point you to 4 of these skills. And I'm assuming that some of you would know some, others would know others. So these are 4 things that you could try out every day. You don't need to be in an office to do this. You could do this immediately after today, or even as you're listening to the talk. So the first is called cognitive therapy, the second called relaxation, the third problem solving, and the fourth strength training. And that this is just now a fancy label for a very common idea that how you think might determine how you feel. So in this case, you might think, I'm in danger, I can't cope. The next time you catch yourself having those thoughts, I wonder if you could just pause and ask yourself, am I really in danger? What's the evidence? Now, we don't want you to immediately go, I'm not in danger, I'm fine, because you might be, right? That sound that you hear downstairs might in fact be the result of a burglar, in which case you might be in danger. But instead of automatically assuming that you're in danger, one of the techniques you can start practicing on yourself is just giving it a bit of pause. What's the evidence that I'm in danger? In fact, you could expand that. How would somebody else think about this situation? What's the evidence against the possibility that I'm in danger? What's the most likely explanation for what's going on for me or around me? Right? One of the take-home points from cognitive therapy, thinking therapy, is that our thoughts are not reflections of reality. Our thoughts are hypotheses of reality. Right? Just because we think something doesn't make it true. So that's the first skill. Pause and ask yourself the question, what's the evidence? The second is relaxation. And I guess I'm assuming that a lot of you have gone through some relaxation training or have used relaxation at some point in your life. But just in case you haven't, I'm going to offer you an experience of a 30-second relaxation experience, if you wanted to do it. I'm going to talk out this particular technique called breathing retraining. And if you would like to follow along, please do so. Breathing retraining is perhaps the simplest, and at least in my view, one of the most effective ways of taking an anxiety pill, metaphorically speaking. It's something that you can do when you feel anxious to lower your arousal, to lower your level of anxiety. And how do you do this? By remembering two things: to breathe slowly and deeply. Right? In fact, it should be called deep and slow breathing. That would make it much clearer, wouldn't it? Right. In fact, you get many, many labels for it. Breathing retraining, deep breathing, breathing exercises, don't forget to breathe. When you say don't forget to breathe to someone, they go, what? That doesn't make sense. Although for some people it does, right? Because they actually stop breathing temporarily when they feel anxious. So here's how you do it. And if you'd like to play along, please feel free to. So just excuse me for a while as I enter into a relaxed state. The way you do this is by putting one hand on your upper chest and one hand on your lower stomach. And if you're sitting, sit comfortably, but you can do this while you're walking, while you're standing like I am right now, while you're lying down in bed. As you can see, I've got my eyes closed, or maybe you have yours too, and that's fine. If you'd like to leave them open, that's okay. Just concentrate on one particular point, perhaps something on the carpet or in the chair in front of you. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to breathe in through your nose at a count of 4. So very slowly, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to ask you to pause for 2 seconds. 1, 2. And then I'm going to ask you to breathe out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then pause for 2 seconds. This is what I'm going to ask you to do. As well as when you breathe in, I'm going to invite you to focus on your lower hand and try and breathe in such a way that your stomach begins to rise and fall. It's your lower hand that seems to be moving, not your upper hand. Your upper hand stays quite still. So, okay, so whenever you're ready, take a deep breath in through your nose, all the way into your lower stomach, and pause for 2 seconds, and then out through your mouth, and pause for 2 seconds. In, and out. And just continue doing that at your own pace. Okay. And slowly finding yourself back in this room, opening your eyes if they were closed. and feeling relaxed and grounded. Okay, so I'm feeling a bit more relaxed. Does anyone feel a bit more relaxed? Some people do. Okay. Look, if it doesn't work for you, give it a go. Typically people say 5 minutes a day for 2 weeks is what it might take to give you that experience. Some people find it very difficult to shift their breathing from shallow breathing to deep breathing. And if that's you, try it when you're lying down. Sometimes it's easier to be done when you're lying down. So that's deep and slow breathing. Okay. So problem solving is an interesting technique and a very effective one, because some people say to me when I talk about cognitive therapy, I'm really in danger. Do you know what my life is like? I live with an abusive partner, or I live in a situation that is actually very dangerous for me, and here you are asking me to think differently? How on earth is that going to help me with my emotions? What I've got to do is actually change something about my situation. So, for example, someone might say, I have trouble sleeping, and that really worries me a great deal, because then I have trouble performing at work the next day. It's not just about thinking differently or going through this deep breathing. I've got to change something so that I can sleep better. That's what I've got to change. I don't have to think differently and breathe differently. So you know this approach, right? Where someone says, I've got to change the situation. What people often don't realize, or so they tell me, is that they don't think of problem solving as a skill. They just think that some people are better or luckier at solving problems than others. And in fact, one of the most effective methods in psychology is called problem-solving therapy. You could spend weeks simply going down this list. Now, if you notice, the first letter of each of these steps spells solve. Isn't that cool? So if you have trouble remembering the steps to problem-solving therapy, all you have to do is remember solve, and hopefully that jogs your memory. So the first thing is to state the problem. I'll give you an example. So the problem might be I have trouble sleeping. Outline the solution. I'd like to sleep, or outline the goal, rather. I'd like to sleep within half an hour of going to bed. All right, that's what I'd like as a goal. The next step is brainstorming. Simply list all of the solutions that you can think of. This is sometimes best done with someone else, because often we get caught up into things that we know, and we might not even consider some of the more interesting options. So for example, if I asked you, what are all the possible ways of helping you fall asleep? What are some of the ones that you might think of? Drink milk? Exercise, not too close from bed, warm shower, meditation. What'd you say? Music. Yeah. And then someone else might say, what about aromatherapy? Or what about the sounds of a deep ocean? You go, what? I've never heard of that. But as brainstorming, it's best done with someone else. So you put your ideas together, you come up with a list of 10 to 20 different solutions. And then the next step is that you verify 3 to try. You choose 3 of those solutions that you'd like to try. Why 3? Because it's manageable. Right? If you choose 1, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, so just choose 3 that you'd like to explore. And then you evaluate the results. A week or 2 later, have a think about whether any of those solutions worked or came close to working. And if they didn't, try another 3 out, and so on. And you'll find that people who are good at solving problems go through these steps recurrently, as opposed to, I can't think of a problem, case closed. Right? They go, what's the problem? What's the goal? What are all the solutions? Even the ones that seem a bit wacky. Right? I'll just choose 3 of these, and then I'll see how I go. And the final one that you can do every day is called exposure therapy. So for someone who's afraid of dogs, let's take a very simple example. One of the best things they can do is find opportunities to encounter dogs. But you probably wouldn't want to introduce them to a Rottweiler just yet, right? You might want to start with a poodle. If you're afraid of heights, just hang on to your ticket for the Rialto Tower, maybe not just yet. Right? Try the first floor first. You don't need a ticket to get to the first floor. In fact, come to Swinburne University, we've got all sorts of floors. Our highest floor is the 10th floor. And once you conquer floor 1, floor 2, floor 3, floor 4, and so on, then cash in your entrance to the Rialto Tower for the, what floor do they have? 120th. Right. So, sorry? Yep, okay. So, the key message here is that exposure is great, but perhaps you'd like to approach it systematically, starting from a less scary situation to a more scary one. And you could expose yourself not just to situations, but also to interoceptive experiences. So, for example, if you have panic, if you have a very catastrophic reaction to feeling aroused, you might want to, in a gradual way, deliberately induce panic-like symptoms. So do exercise, spin around in a chair, breathe really rapidly in a shallow way. These are going to recreate for you symptoms of panic or symptoms of arousal. And you can say to yourself, anxiety is uncomfortable, not dangerous. So a whole bunch of resources for you. We can't get away from the internet, so catch the latest train, the e-therapy or internet therapy train. A lot of these programs are free. So there are lots of these around in Australia, and this is one that Swinburne has developed called Mental Health Online. The Anxiety Recovery Centre have a whole bunch of resources that I'm sure some of you might know about. If you're looking for a psychologist, the Australian Psychological Society has a referral line. Or if you want low-cost, high-quality treatment, think about going along to a university-based psychology clinic and receive psychological treatment for a lower cost often than you can in the community. And you're not bound by a Medicare 10-session per year agreement. You can continue to attend for as many sessions as you want. And the fees are kept fairly low. If you like, think of the psychology clinic as an apprentice hairdresser. Hopefully you get a great haircut for a low price. Thank you.